The wind didn't just bite, it gnawed. It tore through Sarah Mitchell's worn-out coat like a wolf's teeth, sinking deep into her bones. Her hand, raw and red from the cold, flew to her belly. A reflex, a mother's first instinct. Inside, her unborn child was a tiny, fragile warmth in a world of biting ice. She was 7 months along, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. 3 days. It had been 3 days since the wagon train vanished over the horizon, leaving her behind. She didn't know if it was a cruel joke or a terrible mistake. At this point, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the creeping dark, the plunging temperature, and the gnawing certainty that if she didn't find shelter, neither she nor her baby would see the morning. The sun was a dying ember on the western rim of the world, casting long, skeletal shadows that clawed at her from every direction. Her legs were numb, her hope was a flickering candle flame, and every breath was a shard of ice in her lungs. And then she saw it, a thread of smoke, thin and gray against the bruised purple sky. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through her. With the last dregs of her strength, she stumbled toward it, crashing through snow-laden branches, her eyes fixed on that fragile promise of warmth. She had no way of knowing that she wasn't running toward salvation. She was running toward a truth that would unravel everything she thought she knew, a secret buried deeper than any winter snow. Before we dive into the heart of this incredible story, I've got a question for you. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop a comment down below. I'd love to see how far this story travels. And if you find yourself holding your breath, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what I have for you tomorrow is something you won't want to miss. Ohio Territory, 1795. The frontier wasn't a place for the faint of heart, and Sarah Mitchell was learning that lesson the hard way. At 23, she felt 100. She'd been told her whole life that she had a blind spot when it came to men, a willingness to believe in fairy tales when she was living in a world of wolves. But Thomas Reynolds, he had been different. His smile could charm a bird from a tree, and his promises painted a future so bright it blinded her to the darkness hiding in his eyes. He had promised her a new life, a home carved out of the wilderness, a family, and for a year she had believed him. She had followed him away from everything she'd ever known, across mountains and rivers, into the vast, unforgiving heart of the continent. And then, at a dusty, forgotten trading post on the edge of nowhere, he had shattered it all. He was just going to scout the trail ahead, he'd said. He'd kissed her, his hand resting on her swollen belly. "I'll be back by sundown, my love, I promise." Sundown came and went, then another. Sarah tried to hide her panic, assuring the grim-faced trading post owner, Mr. Blackwell, that Thomas was just delayed. "Something must have happened," she repeated, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Mr. Blackwell had seen 1,000 stories like hers play out. His face was a road map of other people's heartbreaks. "Ma'am," he said, his voice devoid of pity, "I saw him ride out, and I saw the way that Wilson woman was looking at him. He loaded his saddlebags heavy. He ain't coming back." Denial was a warm blanket against the cold truth. Sarah refused to believe it. She couldn't. To believe it meant she was stranded, pregnant, with nothing. But on the third morning, as the last of the wagon train prepared to pull out, the blanket was ripped away. Jacob Tanner, the wagon master, a man whose patience had been worn thin by the trail, gave her the final choice. "Mrs. Reynolds, we're burning daylight. Are you coming with us, or are you waiting for a ghost?" Her voice was a strangled whisper. I can't. Thomas has everything. Our money, our supplies. He'll be back. I know he will." Jacob Tanner didn't argue. He just gave her a look that said more than words ever could. A look of profound pity. And then he turned his back. Sarah watched, frozen in disbelief, as the last wagon creaked away, its canvas cover disappearing around a bend in the trail. The silence it left behind was deafening. It was the sound of her life breaking in two. Mr. Blackwell let her sleep by the fire that night, but his charity had its limits. The next morning he was all business. "Can't be running a charity house," he grunted, not meeting her eyes. "There's a settlement about 40 miles east of here. Good people. You might find some work, some help." He scratched a crude map onto a piece of tree bark and handed it to her. 40 miles. On foot. 7 months pregnant. The idea was impossible, but it was the only idea she had. Blackwell wasn't entirely without a heart. He gave her a small sack with a day's worth of dried venison, a hunk of hard bread, and an old wool blanket. Then he pointed her toward the trail and turned back to his post, the heavy wooden door closing with a sound of finality. The first day was a blur of walking, of putting one foot in front of the other, of trying not to think about the vast, empty wilderness around her. But on the second day, a cold, miserable rain began to fall. It soaked through her thin coat, through the wool blanket she'd wrapped around her shoulders, and chilled her to the core. By dusk, she knew with a sickening certainty that she was lost. The trail Blackwell had described was gone, swallowed by an endless ocean of trees. On the third day, the rain turned to snow. The world went silent, muffled by a thick white blanket that erased all landmarks, all hope of direction. Her fingers and toes were numb, her shivering so violent it felt like her bones were rattling apart. Despair was a cold, heavy weight in her gut. She thought of the baby, the innocent life that depended on her. A fierce kick from within, a tiny, insistent pulse, was like a shout in the silence. "I won't give up." The words were a silent promise, a prayer breathed into the frigid air. "I will not let you die out here." It was then, as the last of the daylight was being strangled by the storm, that she saw it. A wisp of smoke, a fragile gray line against the darkening sky. It was so faint she thought she was imagining it, but it was there, a sign of life, a chance. She didn't know who or what was at the other end of that smoke trail. Every campfire story from the journey west had been filled with terrifying tales of attacks, of settlers disappearing without a trace. But the cold was a more immediate enemy, a predator already sinking its teeth into her. The baby had been still for too long. She had no other choice. She stumbled through the snow, falling, picking herself up, her eyes locked on that promise of warmth. It led her to a small clearing, and in the center stood a log cabin, solid, real. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a beacon in the storm. She hesitated at the edge of the trees, her heart hammering against her ribs. Friend or foe? Salvation or something far worse? The cold made the decision for her. She stepped into the clearing, her legs like lead, and staggered toward the heavy wooden door. Her first knock was so weak she barely heard it herself. Silence. She knocked again, this time with all the desperation in her soul. The door creaked open. A man stood there, silhouetted against the firelight within. He was tall, holding a long rifle, and his face was a mask of shadows and suspicion. "Please," she breathed, the single word carrying the weight of all her fear and exhaustion. And then her legs finally gave out. The world tilted, the firelight spun into a blur, and everything went black. But before the darkness took her completely, she felt strong arms catch her, lifting her from the snow. The last thing she remembered was the blessed, impossible sensation of warmth. She woke to the sound of a crackling fire and the smell of roasting meat. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was dreaming, that she was safe in her childhood bed back in Pennsylvania. But then the baby kicked, a sharp reminder of her reality, and her eyes flew open. She was lying on a bed of soft furs near a massive stone fireplace. A pot of something savory bubbled over the flames. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and a chorus of aching muscles forced her back down. "You should rest." The voice came from the shadows on the other side of the room. She turned her head, and the man from the doorway resolved out of the darkness. He sat in a rough-hewn chair watching her. In the flickering firelight, she could see him more clearly. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe around 30. His skin was the color of copper, and his long black hair was tied back with a leather cord. He was dressed in a mix of buckskin and settler's clothing, a half-breed, the very people the wagon train had warned her to fear. "You're Shawnee," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Half," he corrected, his voice a low rumble. "My father was Shawnee. My mother. She was like you." He stood and moved toward the fire, his movements fluid and silent. "My name is Daniel Creek." Sarah pushed herself up again. this time managing to sit, though the effort left her breathless. I'm Sarah, Sarah Reynolds. She still couldn't bring herself to let go of the name, of the life that had been stolen from her. Daniel's dark eyes flicked down to her belly, then back to her face. His expression was unreadable. And where is your husband, Sarah Reynolds? The question was a physical blow, reopening the wound of Thomas's betrayal. We were separated. He'll be looking for me. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Something in Daniel's eyes told her he didn't believe a word of it, but he didn't challenge her. He simply ladled some rich, dark stew into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. Eat, he commanded gently. We can talk tomorrow. The stew was venison and wild roots, the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She devoured it, not realizing until she was scraping the bottom of the bowl how close to starvation she had been. A flush of shame crept up her neck at her lack of manners. Thank you, she said, her voice stronger now. You saved my life. I know, Daniel replied, his honesty as sharp and clean as the winter air. The forest would have claimed you and the child before morning. There was no arrogance in his words, just a statement of fact. It was a strange comfort after months of Thomas's sweet talk and empty promises. Why are you out here alone? She asked, curiosity overriding her exhaustion. He returned to his chair and picked up a piece of wood and a small sharp knife. He began to carve, the wood shavings falling to the floor in silent curls. I prefer it, he said. The settlement has no use for a man like me, and my mother's people were pushed west long ago. He carved with a practiced, steady hand. I belong to neither world, so I made my own. Sarah watched his strong, capable hands. It seems lonely. It's simple, he countered without looking up. No one to lie to you. No one to disappoint. His words hit her harder than he could have known. A lifetime of expectations and disappointments, all culminating in Thomas's ultimate betrayal. She was suddenly so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She lay back on the furs, the warmth of the fire seeping into her chilled bones, and drifted into a sleep deeper than any she had known for months. When she woke, pale morning light was filtering through a single, small window. The cabin was warm and silent. Daniel was gone. She managed to get to her feet, her legs shaky but surprisingly strong. The cabin was one small room, but it was meticulously organized. Shelves held jars of provisions, tools hung from wooden pegs, and a stack of tanned furs stood in one corner. And in another corner, something made her breath catch in her throat. A cradle. It was half finished, the wood sanded smooth, the rockers perfectly curved. It was a work of love, of patient, hopeful expectation. But why was it here? Why would a man who lived alone in the wilderness be building a cradle? The door opened and Daniel entered, carrying an armload of firewood. He stopped short when he saw her standing there, staring at the cradle. A flicker of something, pain, loss, a deep and profound sadness, crossed his face before he masked it. You look better, he said, his voice carefully neutral as he stacked the wood by the fire. I feel stronger, she replied, her eyes still fixed on the cradle. Daniel, why do you have that? He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He looked at the cradle, and for a moment the mask slipped again. I was building it for my son. Sarah's mind reeled. You have a son? Had, he corrected, his voice flat and dead. He died 3 winters ago, along with my wife. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Sarah sank into a chair, trying to process this new, shocking piece of information. All the stories she'd heard, all the warnings. They hadn't prepared her for this. The dangerous savage in the woods wasn't a monster. He was a man drowning in a grief she was only just beginning to understand. And suddenly her own heartbreak felt small in comparison. She had lost a husband to betrayal. This man had lost his entire world. A heavy snow began to fall that afternoon, a thick, silent curtain that sealed them off from the rest of the world. It buried the landscape in a blanket of pristine white, transforming the forest into a place of stark, silent beauty. For Sarah, it felt less like being trapped and more like being hidden, safe within the sturdy walls Daniel had built. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun they could barely see through the swirling snow. They fell into a comfortable, quiet routine. Daniel would hunt or check his traps, moving through the storm like a ghost, while Sarah tended the fire, cooked their meals, and mended her worn clothing. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a shared space, filled with unspoken understanding. They were two broken people, washed up on the shore of this small, warm cabin. But the mystery of his past, of the wife and son he'd lost, gnawed at her. She saw it in the way his eyes would sometimes go distant, staring into the fire as if watching memories play out in the flames. She saw it in the finished cradle that sat in the corner, a silent monument to a future that had never come to be. One evening, as the blizzard howled outside, she finally found the courage to ask. "Daniel," she began softly, "what happened to them? To your wife and son?" He stopped his work, a harness he was mending, and was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, laced with a pain that was still raw. "Her name was Lily," he began, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. "She was like me, caught between worlds. Her father was a French trader, her mother Ottawa. We met, and it was easy. We understood each other without words." He paused, and a faint, sad smile touched his lips. "We built this cabin together. Every log, every stone in that fireplace. It was our world." He took a deep breath, and the smile vanished. "When she was carrying our son, she fell ill. A fever. I knew she needed a doctor. The settlement, the one Blackwell sent you toward, it was a 2-day ride in the snow. I left her here, warm, with food and water. I told her I'd be back." His voice broke on the last word. "I rode like the devil was chasing me. When I got to the settlement, I went straight to the doctor's house. I begged him to come. I offered him every pelt I had, all the money from a year of trading." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his boot. He said he didn't treat savages. He said his skills were for decent folk. He told me to go back to the woods and let our own medicine women handle it." Sarah gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. The cruelty of it was staggering. "I argued, I pleaded. Then I got angry. 2 of the town's men threw me out of his office. They told me if I didn't leave the settlement immediately, they'd have me arrested for threatening the doctor." His voice was a low, dangerous growl. "By the time I found a trapper, an old friend who knew some healing, and got back here, it was too late." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were hollowed out by grief. She was gone. She had delivered the baby alone. A boy. But the fever, the labor, it was too much. They were both gone. I found them. Together. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. Tears for a woman she had never known, for a child who had never drawn a proper breath, for the man sitting across from her, his heart shattered by a hatred he had done nothing to deserve. Now she understood. His kindness to her wasn't just kindness. It was a fierce, desperate atonement. He was trying to save her because he hadn't been able to save Lily. He was determined not to let history repeat itself within the walls of this cabin. The storm finally broke after 7 days. The world outside was a silent, glittering expanse of white. Daniel ventured out, returning with news that the trails were impassable. "Another week at least," he said. Sarah felt a strange sense of relief. The thought of leaving, of facing the world again, filled her with a dread she couldn't explain. Here, with this quiet, broken man, she felt safer than she had in months. That night, as they ate a silent meal of rabbit stew, a sharp, sudden pain shot through her belly. She gasped, dropping her spoon with a clatter. Daniel was on his feet in an instant. "What is it? The baby?" "It's nothing," she said, trying to force a smile. "Just a kick." But an hour later, another pain, sharper and stronger this time, ripped through her. She grabbed the edge of the table, a low cry escaping her lips. "It's too early," she whispered, her voice laced with terror. "It's not due for another month." Daniel's face was a mask of calm, but his eyes were filled with a fierce intensity. "Early doesn't mean trouble," he said, his voice a steady anchor in her rising sea of panic. He moved to her side, helping her to the bed of furs. "My father taught me about birthing. I watched him help many women in my mother's village. Another contraction seized her, and she grabbed his hand, squeezing with all her might. He didn't flinch, his hand a solid, unmoving presence, until the pain subsided. I'm scared, she confessed, her voice trembling. He met her gaze, his dark eyes unwavering. Fear has no place here now, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Only strength. And you, Sarah Reynolds, are stronger than you know. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and exhaustion, a terrifying ordeal that Daniel guided her through with an impossible calm. He seemed to know what she needed before she did. A cool cloth, a sip of water, a word of encouragement. He was a steady presence in the storm of her labor, a rock she could cling to. He wasn't just helping her, he was fighting a ghost. He was fighting the memory of Lily, refusing to let this birth end in tragedy. As the first light of dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gray, a new sound filled the small cabin. Not the howl of the wind, but the strong, healthy cry of a newborn baby. Her daughter. Daniel wrapped the tiny, squirming infant in a soft deerskin and placed her in Sarah's trembling arms. She was perfect, a shock of dark hair, and eyes that, when they opened, were the same deep blue as Sarah's own. Tears of exhaustion, relief, and a fierce, overwhelming love streamed down Sarah's face. Rebecca, she whispered, the name coming to her as if it had always been waiting. Her name is Rebecca. Daniel smiled, a true, genuine smile that transformed his stern face. She is strong, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He gently touched the baby's cheek with one finger. Like her mother. In that moment, holding her daughter, looking at the man who had saved them both, Sarah felt a profound shift inside her. The pain of Thomas's betrayal, the fear of the wilderness, the loneliness of her journey, it all seemed to fade away. It had all led her here, to this small cabin, to this new life, to this unexpected family forged in the heart of a winter storm. She had come here seeking shelter, but she had found something far more important. She had found a home. The days after Rebecca's birth passed in a gentle haze. The world seemed to shrink to the size of the small cabin, its universe contained in the rhythm of feeding, sleeping, and the quiet crackle of the fire. Rebecca was a healthy, hungry baby, and Sarah's life was now measured in these small, precious moments. Daniel was a constant, steady presence. He had finished the cradle, and now it stood by the fire, rocking gently with its precious cargo. He showed her how to fashion soft diapers from rabbit skins and brewed teas from herbs to help with her recovery. He handled Rebecca with a tenderness that made Sarah's heart ache, his large, rough hands impossibly gentle as he held the tiny infant. He never spoke of Lily again, but her presence was a quiet ghost in the cabin. Sarah saw her in the small, feminine touches, a string of polished river stones hanging by the window, a pattern carved into the mantelpiece. This hadn't just been Daniel's home, it had been their home. Sarah was now living in the space another woman's love had built. It was a strange, unsettling feeling, but it was also a comfort. As the snows began to melt, revealing the dormant earth beneath, the reality of their situation began to set in. The trails would soon be clear. A decision had to be made. What will you do? Daniel asked one evening, his voice carefully neutral. He was mending a snowshoe, his face illuminated by the firelight. The question hung in the air between them. Sarah looked at Rebecca, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. The settlement Blackwell had told her about was still out there. She could go, find work as a cook or a laundress. She would be a woman alone with a baby, a target for gossip and pity, constantly struggling. The thought filled her with a cold dread. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I have nothing. No one. Daniel set aside his work. He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. You could stay, he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a world of possibility. Sarah's head snapped up. Here? With you? The cabin is small, he said, but it is warm. The forest provides. The creek never runs dry. He spoke as if listing facts, but there was an undercurrent of something more, a fragile hope. He looked over at the cradle. Rebecca would have a place to grow, a home, away from people who would judge her or her mother. And you, Daniel? Sarah asked quietly. What would you get from this? He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the lonely man beneath the stoic survivor. An end to the silence, he said, his voice rough with emotion. A reason to build, not just to survive. Maybe, in time, a family. Family. The word resonated deep inside her. It was the one thing she had craved her entire life. The thing Thomas had promised and then ripped away. And now here it was, being offered to her by a man she barely knew. A man who had every reason to shut the world out forever. I, I need to think, she stammered. The trails won't be clear for a few weeks yet, he said, picking up his work again, giving her space. There is time. The next morning, Daniel took her somewhere. He fashioned a sling for Rebecca, securing the baby snugly against Sarah's chest. They walked for over an hour, climbing a steep ridge behind the cabin. When they reached the top, they emerged onto a rocky outcropping that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, a vast, rolling sea of green and brown. A river snaked through the valley, glittering in the morning sun. In the far, far distance, a tiny smudge of smoke marked the settlement. It's beautiful, Sarah breathed. My father brought my mother here, Daniel said, his voice soft. When he asked her to share his life, he said she needed to see the world she was choosing, both its beauty and its solitude. He stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. She chose to stay. Sarah understood. This wasn't just a view, it was a proposal. He was offering her his world, his heart, his future. He was offering to share the sacred places of his past. He asked to hold Rebecca, and Sarah carefully transferred the sleeping baby into his arms. Daniel cradled her against his chest, looking out over the land. This could all be hers one day, he said quietly. A home, a legacy, a place where she belongs, where no one can ever take her birthright from her. The thought of Rebecca having a home, a true inheritance, moved Sarah to tears. Thomas had promised her land, but his promises were smoke. Daniel was offering her solid earth, a log cabin, a future built with his own two hands. That night she gave him her answer. I'll stay, she said, her voice firm and clear. Not just for a while, for good, with you. A flicker of pure joy lit his eyes before his calm expression returned. He nodded once. Good. But I need to know, she pressed on. What would I be to you, in your life? He considered her question carefully. A partner, he said finally. In all things. Equals. And Rebecca? My daughter, he said without a moment's hesitation. If you will let me, Thomas gave up that right when he left you. I will raise her as my own blood. I will protect her with my life. Sarah stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body. And me, she whispered, what will I be to you? He met her gaze, his dark eyes searching hers. My wife, he said softly, if you choose it, when you are ready. The honesty, the respect in his offer was more than she had ever dared to hope for. I choose it, she said, her voice thick with emotion, not because I have to, not out of gratitude, but because I think I'm falling in love with you, Daniel Creek. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. His touch was a revelation, tender and reverent. Then we will build a life together, Sarah Mitchell Reynolds Creek, he murmured, a life that no one can ever take away from us. As spring breathed life back into the forest, Sarah and Daniel built their new life. He taught her the ways of the wilderness, how to read the clouds, which plants healed and which harmed, how to be silent and watchful. In turn, she brought a touch of her old world to his. She planted a small garden with seeds he traded for, hung curtains made from an old dress, and in the evenings, she taught him to read from the Bible she had carried with her, the only tangible link to her past. Rebecca thrived. She was a happy, curious baby, adored by the quiet man she would know as her father. Daniel carved her toys from wood and bone, and carried her on his back as he checked his trap lines, whispering the Shawnee names for the trees and animals into her ear. In late spring, they made the journey to the settlement. It was a cluster of a few dozen cabins, a trading post, and a tiny church. The stares they received were a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, a white woman, a half-breed man, and a baby. Their story was written on their faces for all to see. At the trading post, the owner, a man named Ellis, greeted Daniel with a gruff nod. "Creek, been a while." His eyes slid to Sarah and Rebecca, his eyebrows shooting up. "This is Sarah," Daniel said, his voice even. "My wife, and our daughter, Rebecca." He laid a protective hand on Sarah's back. Ellis's eyes widened. "Is that so?" He looked from Daniel's copper skin to Sarah's fair features and back again, his mind clearly struggling to make sense of it. But before Ellis could say more, he paused, a strange look on his face. "Reynolds, you said her name was? Sarah Reynolds?" "It was," Sarah said, her chin held high. "It's Creek now." Ellis scratched his beard, a slow, thoughtful motion. "Funny thing, there was a man in here last fall, asking after a Sarah Reynolds. Said she was his wife." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Thomas? Thomas was here?" "That was the name," Ellis confirmed. "Said his wife, pregnant she was, got left behind at Blackwell's post. Said he was worried sick, trying to find her." Daniel's hand tightened on Sarah's back. His voice was dangerously quiet. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing to tell," Ellis shrugged. "Hadn't seen her. He stayed a day, asked around, then moved on. Headed west." He paused, then added, "But there was something odd about him." "Odd how?" Sarah pressed, her heart hammering. "He said he was worried," Ellis said, lowering his voice. "But his eyes, they were cold, like a snake's. And the woman he was traveling with, the Wilson woman, she looked terrified, like a spooked horse. She never left his side, but she never looked him in the eye neither." Ellis shook his head. It wasn't the picture of a man worried about his lost wife. It was the picture of a man hunting something, or someone. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. Thomas hadn't been searching for her out of love or concern. He had been hunting her. But why? He had gotten what he wanted. A new woman, their money, his freedom. What could he possibly still want from her? As they rode away from the settlement, married in the eyes of the law by a traveling minister, a new fear took root in Sarah's heart. She leaned back against Daniel's solid chest, Rebecca nestled safely between them. She had thought her old life was over, that Thomas was a ghost from her past. But a ghost can't hunt you. Thomas was real, and he was out there somewhere. And for reasons she couldn't begin to fathom, he was still looking for her. The wilderness she had once feared now felt like the only safe place in the world. It was a place to hide. And as she looked at Daniel's determined profile, she knew he would do whatever it took to keep them hidden. Their first summer as a family was an idyll, a pocket of peace in a turbulent world. The garden Sarah planted flourished, providing them with corn, beans, and squash. Daniel taught her to fish in the creek and smoke the trout over a low fire. Rebecca grew from an infant into a curious toddler, her first steps taken on the soft moss outside their cabin door, her first words a mixture of English and the Shawnee. Daniel spoke to her. The fear of Thomas gradually faded, becoming a dull ache rather than a sharp terror. The vastness of the wilderness was their protector. Out here they were ghosts, invisible to the outside world. Sarah found a deep contentment in their simple, rhythmic life. She had never known such peace. Daniel, too, seemed to heal. The deep well of sadness in his eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet joy. He laughed more, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very logs of the cabin. He would sit for hours by the fire, telling Rebecca stories of his own childhood, tales of the Shawnee people, of spirits in the forest and the magic of the natural world. "I never thought I would have this again," he confessed to Sarah one night, as they lay together under a blanket of stars visible through the open window. "A home, a family. You brought the light back into my life, Sarah Creek." In the fall, as the leaves turned to flame and the air grew crisp, Sarah realized she was pregnant again. When she told Daniel, his reaction was a mixture of overwhelming joy and a deep, somber gravity. He placed his hand on her still flat belly, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "This time will be different," he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. "This time, I will be here. I won't fail you." The ghost of Lily was always there, a silent reminder of what he had lost. and what he was so terrified of losing again. He began working on an addition to the cabin, a new room for their growing family. He worked with a feverish intensity, as if by building walls he could keep all the dangers of the world at bay. By the first snow, the room was finished, a new cradle waiting by the bed. But the outside world could not be kept out forever. A traveling fur trader, a grizzled old Scotsman named Mackenzie, stopped at their cabin in late winter, seeking shelter from a storm. He brought with him news that made the small, warm cabin feel suddenly vulnerable. "There's trouble brewing," Mackenzie said, warming his hands by their fire. "The new governor, a man named Harrison, is pushing the tribes hard, buying up land for pennies in treaties the chiefs don't even understand." He shook his head. "There's a Shawnee leader, name of Tecumseh, trying to unite the tribes. His brother, they call him the Prophet, is preaching a return to the old ways. It's a powder keg, waiting for a spark." After Mackenzie left, a new tension settled over the cabin. Daniel began taking longer hunting trips, not just for game, but for information, speaking with other solitary dwellers of the forest. He taught Sarah how to load and fire his rifle, his hands guiding hers, his voice calm and steady. "Knowledge is freedom, Sarah," he told her. "Dependence is a cage." One evening in early spring, he returned from a scouting trip, his face grim. "A family was murdered," he said, his voice flat. "Settlers. The army is blaming a Shawnee raiding party." Sarah's hand flew to her pregnant belly. "Was it?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I saw the tracks. The way it was done. It was white men, made to look like an attack. Someone wants a war, Sarah. Someone who stands to profit from it." The powder keg was about to explode, and their small, peaceful life was sitting right on top of it. A few weeks later, Daniel returned from a trip to a distant trading post with a look on his face that made Sarah's blood run cold. He didn't say anything at first, just held her and Rebecca close for a long time. "What is it?" she finally asked, her voice trembling. "Blackwell was there," he said, his voice a low growl. "The trading post owner who sent you into the wilderness." "What did he say?" "He didn't have to say anything," Daniel said, his eyes dark with fury. "He was talking with another man, bragging, about a deal he'd made with a man named Thomas Reynolds." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. "A deal?" "Thomas didn't just abandon you, Sarah," Daniel said, his voice tight with rage. "He sold you." The words didn't make sense. "Sold me? What are you talking about?" "Blackwell told the man that Thomas had offered him $100 in silver to get rid of you, to send you off on a trail that led nowhere, to let the wilderness take care of his problem. Blackwell said he took the money and pointed you east, straight into the winter storm." The cruelty of it was unimaginable. Thomas hadn't just left her. He had sentenced her, and their unborn child, to death. It wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of weakness. It was a cold, calculated execution. "But why?" she whispered, the question a ragged tear in the silence. "Why would he do that?" "Because of what you were carrying," Daniel said, his gaze dropping to Rebecca, who was playing obliviously on the floor. "Not the baby." He paused as if weighing his next words. "Sarah, what do you know about your mother's family?" The question was so unexpected, it took her a moment to process. "They were from Philadelphia. My grandfather was a silversmith." "Why? Did you ever see this before?" Daniel reached into a small leather pouch he always wore around his neck and pulled out a small, intricately carved silver locket. It was tarnished with age, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. He opened it. Inside, there wasn't a space for a portrait, but a tiny folded piece of parchment. Sarah stared at it, her mind reeling. "My mother, she gave it to me before she died. She said it was a family heirloom, that I should never lose it and never, ever open it. Thomas was always asking about it. He called it my trinket." Daniel carefully unfolded the parchment. It wasn't a letter. It was a deed. A land grant signed by the King of England decades ago, granting ownership of a vast tract of land along the Wabash River to Sarah's great-grandfather. Land that was now at the very heart of the territory Governor Harrison was so desperate to control. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. Thomas hadn't married her for love. He had married her for the deed. He knew what the locket contained, and when he found out she was pregnant, he realized that if anything happened to her, the land would pass to their child. But if both of them disappeared, he, as her grieving husband, could produce a forged will and claim it all. The Wilson woman wasn't a lover. She was an accomplice. Blackwell wasn't just a callous traitor. He was a hired conspirator. Her entire life with Thomas had been a lie, a long con aimed at stealing her inheritance. He wasn't hunting you because he wanted you back, Daniel said, his voice grim. He was hunting you to finish the job, to make sure the only person with a true claim to that land was dead. The world tilted on its axis. The man she had loved, the father of her child, had tried to have her murdered. The betrayal was so profound, so monstrous it almost broke her. But as she looked at Daniel's resolute face, at her daughter playing in the firelight, something else rose up inside her, a cold, hard fury. He had tried to erase her. He had tried to steal her daughter's birthright. She would not let him win. The news changed everything. They weren't just hiding from a ghost anymore. They were hiding from a monster who was actively hunting them. Their peaceful existence was shattered. Every snap of a twig in the forest, every shadow that moved at the edge of the clearing, was a potential threat. "We have to leave," Daniel said that night. "He knows his territory. If he paid Blackwell, he has other connections. It's not safe here anymore." The thought of abandoning the home they had built was agonizing, but the safety of their children was paramount. Sarah's second child, a son, was born in late spring, a strong, healthy boy they named James. His birth was a defiant act of life in the face of so much death. But there was no time for peace. As they prepared to move further west, into lands where the settlements hadn't yet reached, a new threat emerged. 4 riders appeared at the edge of their clearing one afternoon. They weren't trappers or traders. They wore the blue uniforms of the American Army. Leading them was a man with cold, intelligent eyes and the arrogant bearing of a man used to getting what he wanted. He introduced himself as Colonel James Fletcher, an envoy from Governor Harrison. "We're looking for a man named Daniel Creek," Fletcher announced, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, lingering on Sarah and the baby in her arms. "He isn't here," Sarah said, her heart pounding. "Daniel was out hunting." "We'll wait," Fletcher said, his smile never reaching his eyes. He dismounted and his men began to search the area, their movements efficient and predatory. Fletcher's questions were casual, but sharp as a razor. He asked about Daniel's connections to the Shawnee, about his opinions on Harrison's treaties. But then he asked a question that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Tell me, Mrs. Creek," he said, his eyes boring into hers, "did your husband ever speak of a place called Miller's Creek? Of a doctor who refused to treat a sick native woman a few years back?" Sarah froze. How could he know that? It was a story Daniel had told only to her, in the privacy of their cabin. Fletcher saw the look on her face, and his thin smile widened. "I thought so. You see, that doctor filed a report about a violent half-breed who threatened him, a man who, a few days later, was suspected of setting a fire that destroyed the doctor's barn. He let the accusation hang in the air. The doctor is a personal friend of Governor Harrison, and the governor takes threats against his friends very seriously. This wasn't a random patrol. Fletcher wasn't just looking for a native sympathizer. He was here for Daniel specifically. He was using the threat of war as a pretext to settle a personal score. Daniel wasn't just a target. He was a loose end. He was the only witness to the doctor's, and by extension, Fletcher's, inhumane cruelty. When Daniel returned that evening, Sarah told him everything. The last vestiges of their peaceful life burned away in the face of this new, terrifying reality. They were caught between 2 relentless hunters, Thomas Reynolds, who wanted their land, and Colonel Fletcher, who wanted Daniel's life. "Tonight," Daniel said, his voice grim, "we leave tonight." They packed what little they could carry. The silver locket, now a symbol of both their peril and their hope, Sarah secured in a small pouch around her own neck. Under the cover of darkness, they slipped away from the cabin, their home, their sanctuary, and melted into the forest. It felt different this time. Before they were hiding. Now they were refugees. Their journey west was a desperate flight. They traveled by night, hiding during the day, always watching, always listening. They joined a small, sad caravan of other mixed-blood families, also fleeing Fletcher's persecution. They shared stories around small, hidden campfires, tales of homes burned, of families torn apart. Their destination was a settlement on the Wabash River called Prophetstown, the village founded by Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa. It was said to be a place of refuge, a community where those caught between two worlds could live in peace. But when they arrived, they found not a peaceful village, but an armed camp. The air was thick with tension, with the talk of war. Tenskwatawa, the prophet, was a man of fiery charisma, who preached of a vision where his followers would be immune to the white man's bullets. The young warriors believed him, their eyes burning with fervent faith. Daniel saw it for what it was, a beautiful lie, a path to annihilation. "This is not a refuge," he told Sarah, his voice low and urgent. "It's a target." They had fled one danger only to land in the middle of another. Harrison's army was marching toward Prophetstown. Tecumseh was away, trying to rally more tribes. The prophet was in command, promising his followers a miraculous victory. Daniel was faced with an impossible choice: to stay and fight alongside people he knew were marching to their deaths, or to flee again, to abandon the only community that had ever accepted them. The night before the battle, as warriors danced and chanted around the fires, sure of their invincibility, Daniel made his decision. "My family comes first," he told Sarah. They prepared to slip away at first light, to head north toward the Great Lakes, to disappear so completely that no one could ever find them again. But as they were leaving, a figure blocked their path. It was Tenskwatawa. His single eye gleamed in the firelight. "You are leaving, Daniel Creek," the prophet said. It was not a question. "I will not lead my family into a slaughter," Daniel replied, his voice respectful but firm. The prophet was silent for a long moment. Then he looked at Sarah, at Rebecca clutching her mother's hand, at James asleep in his sling. "Some must survive," he said, his voice suddenly weary. "Some must live to tell the story of what happens here, to tell the truth." He handed Daniel a small carved stone. "Go north. Find the people of the Painted Rocks. Show them this. They will give you shelter." He turned and walked back toward the fire, toward his destiny. They fled into the darkness, leaving the doomed village behind. The next morning, as the sun rose, they heard the distant thunder of Harrison's cannons. The Battle of Tippecanoe had begun. The beautiful lie had been shattered, and a community born of hope was being wiped from the face of the earth. They traveled for weeks, through a harsh, unforgiving wilderness, guided only by Daniel's knowledge and the hope of finding the people of the Painted Rocks. They were exhausted, grieving for the people they had left behind, but they were together. One afternoon, as they made camp near a small lake, Daniel was scouting the area when he froze. He held up a hand, signaling for Sarah to be silent. She quickly gathered the children, her heart pounding. Through the trees she saw them, two men leading their horses. One was a rough-looking man she didn't recognize. The other was Thomas Reynolds. Her blood ran cold. He had found them. Even here, in the deepest part of the wilderness, he had tracked them down. Daniel pushed her and the children behind a rocky outcropping. "Stay here. Do not make a sound," he whispered, his eyes like chips of flint. He slipped away, silent as a shadow, his rifle in his hand. Sarah crouched behind the rock, her arms wrapped around her children, her body trembling. She could hear their voices getting closer. "Are you sure this is the way?" the stranger asked. "There's nothing out here." "The half-breed is smart," Thomas's voice replied, and the sound of it made Sarah's skin crawl. "But he can't hide from me forever. That deed is mine. I'll track him to the ends of the earth if I have to." There was a sudden, sharp crack. Not a rifle shot. Something else. A cry of pain. Then silence. Sarah held her breath, her mind racing. What had happened? Where was Daniel? The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. She had to know. Risking a glance around the edge of the rock, she saw a scene that would be burned into her memory forever. The stranger lay on the ground, an arrow protruding from his chest. Thomas stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and terror, staring into the trees. And then, Daniel stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't holding his rifle. He was holding the long, curved bow of a Shawnee warrior. "It's over, Reynolds," Daniel said, his voice calm and deadly. Thomas fumbled for the pistol at his belt, but he never had the chance. Daniel moved with a speed that was terrifying, inhuman. He closed the distance between them in two long strides, and the fight was over before it began. There was a brief, brutal struggle, and then Thomas lay on the ground, disarmed and gasping for breath. Daniel stood over him, his face a mask of cold fury. Sarah rushed from behind the rock, her own rifle now in her hands, ready to defend her family. "You tried to kill her," Daniel snarled, his voice a low growl of pure hatred. "You tried to kill my son for a piece of paper." Thomas looked from Daniel's furious face to Sarah's, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "You think this is about the deed?" He rasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "The deed is just money. This is about you." He was looking at Sarah, his eyes filled with a venomous obsession. "If I can't have you," he choked out, "no one can." Before anyone could react, he lunged, not at Daniel, but at Sarah. His move was clumsy, desperate, but it was enough to knock her off balance. She stumbled backward, the rifle flying from her hands. Thomas grabbed at the locket around her neck, his fingers tearing at the leather cord. And then a new figure burst from the trees. Not a warrior, not a hunter. It was Colonel Fletcher. He held a pistol, and it was aimed directly at Daniel. "Drop your weapons, Creek," Fletcher commanded, his voice ringing with triumph. "It's over." The world had devolved into a nightmare. They were trapped, Thomas holding Sarah hostage, Fletcher holding a gun on Daniel. "Let her go, Reynolds," Fletcher said, his voice impatient. "You can have whatever you want. Just let me deal with him." But Thomas wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, fixed on Sarah. "It's mine," he hissed, ripping the locket from her neck. He held it up like a trophy. "It's all mine now." In that moment of distraction, Daniel acted. He threw himself not at Fletcher, but sideways into Thomas, sending both of them crashing to the ground. Fletcher, startled, fired his pistol, but the shot went wild, embedding itself in a tree. Sarah scrambled away, gathering her children to her. The scene was chaos. Daniel and Thomas were locked in a desperate struggle on the ground. Fletcher was reloading his pistol, his face a mask of fury. And then from the lake came a new sound, the sound of paddles slicing through water. A dozen canoes filled with warriors were heading for the shore. Their faces were painted, their weapons ready. The people of the painted rocks. The prophet's message had been received. Fletcher saw them. He knew he was outnumbered, outmatched. With a curse, he turned and fled, disappearing back into the forest. The struggle on the ground ended. Daniel rose, his face bruised but resolute. Thomas lay still. The locket had fallen from his grasp and lay half buried in the pine needles. The lead warrior, a tall, imposing man with eyes that seemed to see everything, stepped ashore. He looked at the scene, at Daniel, at Sarah and her children, at the body of Thomas Reynolds. He looked at the stone pendant around Daniel's neck. He nodded once. "The prophet sent word you would come," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "You are welcome in our lands. You are safe now." Safe. The word felt foreign, a language she had forgotten how to speak. She looked at Daniel, her husband, her savior, the father of her children. She looked at Rebecca and James, her precious, resilient children. She picked up the locket from the ground, the deed to a world she no longer wanted. She walked to the edge of the lake, and with a final decisive gesture, she threw it as far as she could. It spun through the air, a silver glint against the blue sky, before landing with a small splash and disappearing beneath the surface. The land, the money, the life Thomas had tried to steal, none of it mattered. He hadn't understood. Her inheritance wasn't a piece of paper. It was the strength in her heart, the love for her family, the courage to build a new life from the ashes of the old. 20 years later, Sarah stood on that same shore, watching her grandchildren play in the shallows. The small, desperate band of refugees had become a thriving community, a new harbor built on the principles of respect and cooperation. Daniel stood beside her, his hand in hers, their fingers intertwined with the easy familiarity of a lifetime of love. Their son James was now a doctor, His skills, a blend of the medicine he'd learned in Boston and the traditional healing of his father's people. Their daughter, Rebecca, ran a school where native and settler children learned side by side, their histories woven together into a single shared story. The world had changed, but they had endured. They had faced down monsters, both civilized and savage, and had chosen not to become them. They had lost everything, only to find that they already had everything that truly mattered. They had lived to tell the story, a story of betrayal, of survival, of a love that was stronger than greed, and a family that was built not on blood or land, but on the unshakable foundation of a shared heart. So what do you think? It's a wild ride, isn't it? If you enjoyed Sarah's story of survival and resilience, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because I've got another story lined up that you are not going to want to miss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.